If you were stuck in the middle of a maddening carnival parade that definitely smelled worse than a Smash Bros tournament, locked into Mortal Kombat with a parasol-wielding, bad blood fiend that punished you for even dealing damage to her, what would you do? Let's analyze her skill set, mechanics, and gameplay strategy so you can beat Canto 7 Act 2 and prepare yourself for the dream to finally end in Act 3. I'll also give you some recommendations for strategy, teams, and units to help you out. Dulcinea is... Dulcinea. Frick, sorry I'm not Spanish.
Dulcinea.
Dulcinea is the beautiful yet deadly mid-boss for Canto 7, the dream ending. She falls under a tactician type of character, with mechanics involving commanding and leading a band of reinforcements to do her bidding. Fair warning, there is a heavy incentive to play into her mechanic. Out of all boss fights in the game, this one is up there for bosses that severely punish players for relying only on the win rate button. Sporting a core of 2,745 HP, a special panic type, high defense score, no glaring weaknesses against damage types, and only a single stagger threshold, she is quite the tanky adversary to behold. Oh, and not to mention the legion of minions that are fielded at her side to defend her. Don't worry, the game gives you Jiaxi Chun as a 7th party member to even the odds. And trust me, she totally doesn't suffer from terrible AI clash targeting. This fight, unlike some multi-phase boss fights, is a single-stage fight. Once you kill the boss, the fight ends. That being said, to help Dulcinea not die instantly, she employs the assistance of a near-endless wave of mobs that flood in every turn to defend her, starting with an initial 8, and then additional ones that come in waves of 2 afterwards. This is by all intents and purposes a war of attrition. Survive or be destroyed. There is no other choice. Sorry. If you want to get straight to the fight guide and don't want to listen to me drone on about how her abilities work, click this timestamp. Otherwise, buckle up. Before we break down this fight, let's look at her skills. She sports a slew of passives as well as a handful of very powerful abilities. As always, we'll start by reviewing her core passives. As all starving children of the first kindred are, Dulcinea starts with Withered, a debuff that gives her minus 35 offense and minus 35 defense, which sounds like a huge crippling debuff, because it is. And boy, do you need all the help you're gonna get. Dulcinea has access to the Blood Feast Blood Pool, a secondary resource which bolsters her throughout the fight. She sports not one, but 2 gameplay mechanics that are sure to make even the mightiest adventurers cry. First is her Blooming Thorns, a unique defensive ability shared by some Blood Fiends that inflicts a small amount of bleed, equal to half the value of this buff, onto the aggressor, aka you. She can build these stacks of thorns on herself with a few abilities, more on these later. Any sinners that even dare touch her will start to bleed out and donate blood to the Blood Feast pool for her to drink on following turns. But Lei Zhu Shen, 5 potency isn't that bad, I can tank it. You're right, you can. But you won't be able to do it so easily once the blooming thorns begin to blossom. Dulcinea has 2 passives that bolster the power of her thorns as the fight nears its end. Parade of Happiness and Eternal Parade of Happiness are both passives that make the blooming thorns stronger. When she drops to 66% HP for the first time, she not only gains a small speed increase, but also turns her blooming thorns into blood-woven thorns. And the abilities that would give blooming thorns will now give this stronger version instead. Now instead of only giving half the stack's value in bleed potency, it gives the full value. If she has 10 blood-woven thorns, you're gaining 10 bleed. If you're a multi-hitter that hits 4 times, that's 10, plus 9, plus 8, plus 7. Devastating, right? Not only this, but this heightened state also gives up to 2 offense level, inflicts more bleed and bleed count with her offensive skills, buffs her allies even more than before, and clash better herself. A sizable buff. On top of this, her allies also start gaining their own thorns, as well as Festive Fever, an offense level increase buff every turn. And if you thought that wasn't deadly enough, Eternal Parade is the passive that procs at the last 1/3 of her life. She gains even more speed, turning her measly 2 to 4 into a hefty 4 to 6. She immediately preps a strong skill, the Finale. Her Blood-Woven Thorns evolves into its final stage, the Blood Molded Thorns. And let me tell you, everything you thought was already crazy about Blood-Woven Thorns? She does that now, but more. In every way possible. You don't want to be locked into a fight much longer after she awakens to this form, as you'll find that not only is every clash completely hopeless, she also heavily outspeeds you at every corner. And what little damage you can manage to make stick, you'll be repaid in full by taking an equally hefty amount of bleed onto yourself. Her second mechanic, yeah, we're still on her mechanics, is a 2-in-1. because they both do similar things. Festive Fever is a stack she builds over time. At 10 or more, she'll consume them to use a strong AoE skill. The Imperfect Parade is a buff that stacks instead when she loses allies in battle. While this one doesn't do much in the buffing department, it's another way for her to access a different AoE skill. When she's at 5 or more stacks, she'll consume them to dish out some pain. Luckily, she can't use both at the same time due to Festive Fever's effect, but that still begs the question. AoE if you don't kill things fast enough, and AoE if you do. Seems like there's no winning against her skills, is there? Well, enough ruminating. Let's look at her tool belt. For the most part, unless she has stacks of Festive Fever or Imperfect Parade to burn, she'll only have access to 4 moves. 3 attack skills in Walk with Grace, Move with Beauty, and Beckon the Audience Hither, as well as a defensive clashable counter in And That's All It Does. While these skills all have pretty low base rolls, rolling a max of 12, 12, 13, and 13, they all gain considerable clash power boost as well as start to apply heavy amounts of bleed later in the fight. Along with ways to keep topping up her own sanity, you'll find yourself scratching your head in confusion when all your dominatings turn into hopeless out of the blue. While her 2 wrath abilities are nothing that special, they can be used to bleed or buff her own allies. Sometimes the buff applied can mess with your damage calculations. That being said, it's really her pride and envy skills that you need to worry about. Beckon the Audience Hither is a skill that hits hard and gives her Blooming Thorns no matter what, given that it's on an unbreakable coin. Her clashable counter, And That's All It Does, is another skill that builds up her thorns fast, requiring you to win clash if you don't want her to do so. No, offsetting doesn't count. At this point you're wondering, what about her AoE skills? You said she had them, right? Well, I'm glad you asked. With enough Festive Parade, she can use Parade of Wonders, a skill that hits basically the whole screen. Her allies get buffed. It also racks up thorns on all of her allies, meaning you don't want her to use this too much. Additionally, with enough Imperfect Parade stacks, she'll be able to use her AoE skill, The Parade Repeats for Eternity, a devastating skill that heals her up and heals her even more if you let all those coins hit you. This is a skill you want to beat in a clash every time you see it. But there seems to be one more skill in the roster. What could it be? Well, remember this line of text? When she drops below the threshold, this is the bad boy she'll pull out. The finale. And trust me, she means it. If she doesn't lose this clash, you'll probably lose the run, or at least have your team in shambles, struggling to even stand back up like a bad yaoi fanfiction. Remember when I said 5 seconds ago that the Parade Repeats for Eternity is a clash you don't want to lose? Well, the finale is a skill that you definitely, and I cannot emphasize this enough, absolutely, under no circumstances do you want to lose against this skill in a clash. Got it? Good. Now you're probably thinking, if this is a single stage fight with an infinite number of enemies to flood in, then all you need to do is rush down the boss lady as soon as the fight starts, right? Well, you would be right if not for the fact that the game forces you to take it slow. You can't simply just take out the diva of the parade first. The parade's lady is the last trick up her sleeve, starting with a whopping 8 stacks of protection. Losing only 1 stack when an ally dies means that until you chew through those first 8 defending paraders, you won't be dealing any damage to her. The only saving grace from all of this carnage is her Achilles heel. This isn't how it ends, which staggers her every time she runs out of allies. This means that while she only has 1 stagger threshold, you'll get guaranteed easy staggers throughout the fight. Your first staggers when you kill all 8 of her starting minions, and then every time you kill the 2 kindred she spawns when she unstaggers, you'll stagger her again. This means that technically you can stagger her every other turn if you're strong enough. With all this in consideration, your game plan will be as follows. Step 1. Avoid hitting her when her shield is up. Step 2. Kill off her first 8 minions to make her drop her protective shield. Step 3. Win clash against all of her AoE skills to keep your team healthy. Step 4. Dump all your damage on her when she gets staggered. When you select your team in this fight, you'll be forced to field Don Quixote in your starting lineup. I'd recommend taking a Don that has good clash values like Senk or W, or one that synergizes with your team, such as Lantern if you're running a Rupture team for example. Granted, any Don, even base Don, is decent here, as she gets a permanent buff this Canto. How righteous! This permanent buff gives her an insane stat boost every turn and scales up as the fight goes on, keeping her mentally happy and strong throughout the fight. Other than that, the rest of your team can be whatever you have built. I recommend a Rupture or Sinking team, which is what I use to beat it, but people are soloing this stage with base Don Quixote, so it really can't be that hard, right? The first phase of this fight is simple. Dulcinea approaches the stage with 3 supporting cast members. While each of these mobs has some pretty nasty moves, they only get 1 slot each, with Dulcinea getting 4 slots, each using one of her 4 basic moves. This puts you at 7 slots, with the help of your wildcard Jiaxi Chuan, to their 7 slots, or so it would seem. But since Walk with Grace and Move with Beauty always target her allies first with buffs, and are not used for clashing, it's actually your 7 slots to their 5. Use this numbers advantage to start allocating damage towards those shitty mobs to kill them off as soon as possible. In this first phase of the fight, I'd recommend you avoid confrontation with Dulcinea herself as much as possible, as hitting her protection won't do any damage and only serve to bleed you out faster. Save your ego resources as well, and don't waste strong egos unless it's absolutely critical. While you can't control Sichuan herself, you should try to at least work with her and not against her. See where she wants to attack, and don't stack up on Dulcinea if she tries it. Just let the idiot win rate presser go for it and take hits for you. Additionally, you should be watching which ally Dulcinea is hoping to buff next turn, and focus that unit down first. Try to stagger that buffed unit so it can't make use of the buffs the turn after. Dulcinea and all of her posse start off with basically 0 speed, which means you'll be able to deal the pain out to her minions before she has a chance to buff them. Take winning clashes against her minions, and only interact with Dulcinea's beckon the audience hither, and that's all it does. You can choose to win against these clashes, but since you won't be hitting her at all for much damage in this first phase, you can also play this defensively instead. Using defensive skills is a smart choice, since her pride skill sports an unbreakable coin that still does quite a bit of damage even if you beat her, and her clashable counter is, well, it's a counter, and can still chip some damage in while you're not being careful. I personally went with a defensive approach for these reasons. Choosing to block her pride skill entirely with someone with a big shield and offsetting her counter with a defensive skill of your own are some viable strategies, as both avoid dealing damage to her and in turn avoid stacking bleed on yourself. I went with blocking beckon the audience hither with my Diechi Radya, who has an insane Giga Shield, and sometimes even use WH Heat's counter to offset her counter, as I'd still get its skill benefits and get on the horse regardless. But whoever you have that can serve similar roles can be a good play as well. All things considered, you might consider wanting to win a clash against her counter skill at least the turn before her AoE, so that you can lessen the amount of thorns on her for the next turn. The main goal of this first phase is to defend against her light jab attacks while dismantling her front line as quickly as possible. The more turns that pass, the harder and harder the fight will become. When she reaches 10 Festive Fever, she'll gain a 5th slot to use specifically the skill Parade of Wonders. That being said, even if Sichuan trolls her targeting completely, you'll still have enough slots to clash/block everything you need. When she reaches 5 Imperfect Parade, she'll spend the next turn with only a single slot. The parade repeats for eternity. This means that not only will you have an easy time picking the right character to beat her in a clash, but also have ample windows to allocate more slots into her minions. Use the turns where she only uses the parade repeats for eternity to deal considerable damage to her forces. After you destroy her first 8 minions, she'll become staggered for the first time. You'll get a chance to dump all of your damage on her here, and most likely reduce her HP below 66%, proccing her passive, Parade of Happiness. This is where the second phase begins. All things considered, the second phase is much like the first. Your main goal will be to kill her minions that she keeps spawning. This procs her passive, staggering her the next turn after her minions die, allowing you to pump more damage onto her while her resistances are down. Unlike the first phase, she and her minions will be stronger and faster, but don't let that deter you. Given that you've had time to build up sanity from phase 1, you'll still be in good shape to win clashes. Additionally, she won't have the Parade's Lady passive anymore, meaning you'll now be able to deal damage to her with AoE skills and not feel like you wasted them. In this phase, keep up the pace, but also you'll be able to use her AoE skills and middle power egos where needed. I'd recommend bringing some sinners with healing egos to keep your team topped up. Faust's Fluid Sack and Ishmael's Bygone Days were my go-to, but Radya or Masso's Pursuance or even Sinclair's Soup can be helpful here. If you don't have those, you can consider IDs that heal themselves, or IDs that can staunch the flow of blood. The new Fanghun Honglu, which is a 2-star and easy to pull or dispense, comes with a great passive that cuts your team's bleeding, potentially saving them from taking a lot of damage. Since this phase upgrades her thorns, it's a good idea to start thinking about beating out her clashable counter if you plan on hitting her more, as she will lose 5 whole stacks of thorns when she loses this clash. Additionally, since her Bloodwoven Thorns, unlike Blooming Thorns, also depletes, you can easily drain her empty of thorns when you get a turn to punch her to the ground. The second phase is admittedly also quite straightforward. Just rinse and repeat this process until you can bring her down to 33% HP. A good strategy is to keep her at 34% HP and then try to nuke her down to 0, or almost 0. This is ideal as you may be able to skip the third phase entirely, but if not, we'll move on to explaining the last stage. At 33% or below, she'll enter her most dangerous state. Her thorns will hurt like crazy, and she'll apply a ton of count. So multi-coin skills become increasingly more dangerous to use, as you won't be able to shake off the bleeding easily anymore. Upon unstaggering, it'll instead be her ace skill, the Finale. I will emphasize this again. Do not lose against this clash. Your whole team will suffer considerably. Do whatever it is you need to do in order to beat it. At this phase, she'll have considerably fast speed. The turn she tries to use the finale is a great time to use your Durante Pigricia in order to cut her speed in half, allowing your slower, possibly stronger clashing sinners to face off against her instead. I'd recommend clashing with an ego that has good high rolls. Something like Isang's Sun Shower does well here, but any ego that clashes consistently high will work here. After surviving the finale, it's a free-for-all. This is as strong as she's going to get. Sometimes she'll be able to pump up her own sanity, and you'll find yourself face-to-face with screens full of unfavored or even hopeless clashes. At this point, do whatever it is you'll need to win. For myself, I found that sticking to the earlier plan of killing her minions to stagger her so I can get clean hits in was the play. But if you find that you can't kill her minions reliably or have big nuke damage, then perhaps the best course of action is just to try to kill her as fast as you can. This is a great phase to use your high-powered egos to guarantee clash wins, pump out damage numbers, or debuff enemies heavily in order to make future turns easier. If you've done all of this correctly, then congrats. You completed the boss fight for Act 2 and are ready to move on to the highly anticipated Act 3. Have fun.